critical mass point that, you know, our societies are facing, North American, Australian, wherever you go in the planet, they're all the same issues. And one of the driving issues that I think can make a big difference as to whether or not we have an agricultural aha moment for larger than the groups that we're associating ourselves with is the health crisis. In the United States, the health crisis there is, it's beyond a crisis. It's hopeless because of the fact that we have over 300 million people, and over 80 million of us, me included, are in what we call the baby boom generation, which is over 80 million strong. All those folks are becoming elders as opposed to seniors, of course. And, you know, and we're waiting collectively for the government to come through with, you know, the Medicare, Medicaid answers to what have nothing to do with medicine, or health, I should say. And so the healthcare crisis is really an agricultural crisis. And this is where the lectures back home, and I deal with a lot of the folks that are dealing with the plain community, I mentioned this earlier today, who are really picking up on this, because where I live, Pennsylvania, there's Philadelphia on the eastern end of it, and there's Pittsburgh on the western end of it. And those cities actually are having food renaissances. I'm a member of the Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Agriculture. I'm a board member there. We're probably the largest single sustainable ag organization in the United States. We have a conference every February that amounts to about maybe 2,300 to 2,400 people. And what I like seeing in these attendees is the age group. And every year we have a larger and larger percentage of the total that are young people looking for answers about their future. And this would include the generation of my kids. I'm a grandfather 4 times, because they know. I mean, this is no secret. They know that their future is being stolen from them, right? Their future is being stolen from them from their health perspective, from an economic perspective, from an environmental perspective. The social networking that's going on is viral. And so you don't need 51% of the population that we care about to make the difference. You need basically a strong 10%. Once you get the strong 10%, the next 10% is a whole lot easier than the first 10%. So we're at the 1% basis right now, maybe we're more than that. Some areas we're more than that. But what's interesting is it's logarithmic. And I think the reason why it's logarithmic is because the healthcare crisis is a food crisis. The food crisis is an agricultural crisis. So when I talk about food as medicine, we can't fix the healthcare crisis until we fix agriculture, period. That's it, end of story. And we can have all the discussions we want about whether there's going to be enough money for Medicaid or Medicare or all kinds of emergency, heroic kinds of inputs. But until we fix the agricultural debacle, we can't fix medicine. And if we can't fix medicine, our kids and our grandkids don't have much of a future. They know that more than my generation knows that. So that's some of the good news that's wrapped up in this bad news. So that's kind of what this talk is focused on. And, you know, there was surveys taken from the end of World War II asking Americans, are you very satisfied, very happy with your life? And the answers that were predominantly yes peaked in 1956. And it's been downhill ever since. Less than 25% of Americans that are asked, are you very fulfilled and happy with your life, can answer that affirmatively today. And if you think of what happened in 1956, 1957, here's what happened in my opinion. This was one of the first things that started creeping up was the fast food industry, which you can see up on these statistics here. You know, in 1970, it hit $6 billion, and in 2000 it was $110 billion, more than automobiles, computers, and college education combined. All right, so this is where a lot of our issues are, is in the fast food industry, because this isn't food. This is something else other than food. It's definitely not medicinal, right? The other thing that happened was in 1959, the Committee for Economic Development proposed a way to empty the countryside through policies of dropping the parity prices for farmers so that they would have an incentive or to be discouraged to farm and move to the urban areas to have an affordable, quote unquote, labor supply. And the third thing that happened around that time was the invention of the suburb. I don't know if you hear of Levittown, Pennsylvania, but that was the first suburb, was Levittown, Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia. And of course now it's a virus that's all over the planet, which has done what? It's basically disassociated individuals from one another. The sense of community has now been broken, where there used to be 8 people living per square acre. There's now 2 because of the suburban mindset. So between suburbs, fast foods, and government policies that said rural institutions need to go away, we now have multiple facets of problems that have combined to create these dissatisfied Americans and to create healthy problems or unhealthy problems that are actually manifesting in the fact that we can't fix it with conventional medicine. So this is what we're seeing now. In America, 1/5 of their meals are eaten in cars. Americans feed 1/3 of their children daily in fast food restaurants. And so now we have the National Institute of Health came out with a very alarming prognosis for the future, which is the class of 2018, which is 5 years away. Kids that are going to graduate high school in 2018 were born in 2000. 35% of the Caucasians, 40% of the African Americans, and 52% of the Hispanic kids are going to get type 2 diabetes. Now think about that. Now that's a very profound prognosis. It's a very profound prophecy because, you know, what we had in 2008 was 25 million diabetics, and they're expecting 50 million by 2050. But currently we have what's known as the pre-diabetic, which is syndrome X. Those are people right on the edge. That's another 60 million people. So 1 out of 3 Americans currently are either diabetic or pre-diabetic. Why should we care about that from a national security issue? Because diabetes is the #1 cause of blindness, the #1 cause of kidney failure or dialysis, the #1 cause of limb amputation, the #1 cause of stroke. Those are all big ticket items, and it's not a coincidence that large pharmaceutical companies are gearing up for this by building more insulin plants, right? This is the way they're going to deal with this issue, is to have not an antidote to the problem, but a remedy that benefits the shareholders of those corporations at the expense of who? Children, right? These are kids we're talking about that used to be called adult onset diabetes. Now it's called type 2 diabetes because kids are getting it. So the age of diabetes is really the big issue in America. And by the way, Australians have their version of this. You guys like a lot of carbohydrates like we do. You like sugar, you like sweets, and we're addicted. And if you think sugar is not addictive, try quitting it sometime, right? It's more addictive actually physiologically than heroin. It's more physiologically addictive than nicotine. It's more physiologically addictive than just about anything because it drives the hormone insulin. And insulin is one of the most potent hormones there is. In fact, if you think estrogen drives women mad, insulin drives everybody crazy, right? So this is what we have coming up. There's a huge wave of diabetes that's about to hit the beaches in a few years. And we don't have any way of coping with it other than to treat it. And we can't treat it unless you prevent it. So our hunger, 60% of Americans are overweight, 20% of Americans are obese. We're going to move that up in just a few years. 75% of Americans will be overweight and 40% will be obese, deadly fat, right? That's like not a healthy way to be. And that's why there's so much fat phobia in America, because we're being advised by the experts that fat consumption causes fatness, overweightness, obesity, when in fact that's not what causes fatness. Good fats, you actually will lose weight. Right? That's a fact, Jack. It's carbohydrates that create triglycerides, which are blood fats. Triglycerides and blood glucose levels drive insulin. Insulin is a smart hormone because the blood doesn't want sugar in there, and so it gets rid of it quickly, and it packs it in the adipose areas. Right? So this is why I had cousins come over from Italy in 1997. And Italians eat a lot of pasta, but a lot of people don't realize that pasta in Italy, it's mostly not flour, it's mostly eggs. The flour is the glue that holds the eggs together, you know? Heart healthy experts dietary recommendations. So here's what's happened. Grain consumption's going crazy. High fructose corn syrup, which is a whole nother evil, much worse than sucrose. We now have a wheat that was virtually invented. I mean, the original wheat was einkorn wheat, and then there was emmer wheat. And then the Green Revolution came, and we created this new Cevitam wheat, which was a hybridized wheat, not a GMO wheat, that completely changed the starch structure of that wheat. You know, the daily bread that was once upon a time quite sacrosanct became something that created incredible amounts of allergies as well as obesity, because the amyloid pectin A starch that's in that wheat actually has a higher glycemic index than table sugar. So this is another reason why Americans and other people who eat wheat products are in effect fooled into believing that, you know, our daily bread is not even whole grain breads, by the way. Doesn't matter. It's the amylopectin A starch that's in the new hybridized wheat since the Green Revolution that causes high surges of blood sugar. Remember, when you get a high surge of blood sugar, because blood sugar is not healthy to have in the blood, the body does the best to get rid of it through insulin by packing. If they can't get it into the cell, you get what's called basically insulin resistance. And so the next best thing is to pack it where it does the least amount of damage. So I remember having breakfast of champions growing up. Cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, Trix are for kids. But these cereals still exist, and you can see the amount of sugar on these cereals right here. Not to mention the rest of it's probably a corn or a wheat, and now the corn is GMO. These kids are going off to school. That's considered a good breakfast. That's considered a good American breakfast. Am I in your way? Can you see that? All right. And then we have this guy. And I'm a survivor of this particular phenomena, and we now have 41% of Americans diagnosed with cancer, and 20% of Americans are going to die from cancer. You know, oncology wards are booming everywhere. This is a huge industry. And the main reason why we have such a high rate of cancer is a lot of reasons. I'm going to talk about cancer when it's Monday night more specifically. There's a whole variety of issues that create cancer. Emotional issues play a role, environmental issues play a role, and the food issue plays a big role, because the fact is that cancer can only live on, guess what? Glucose. The energy to burn fuel in the cells, in these little furnaces called the mitochondria, that's the furnace of the cell. You can burn glucose, or you can burn fats, you can burn proteins. Cancer doesn't do well burning fats or proteins. It only can burn glucose. Very inefficient at burning fats. And so as the glycemic loads go up in the diet, guess who's the beneficiary of the high glycemic diet? Cancer cells. You know, in the old days, medicine was supposed to basically keep you healthy, and you paid for that, and if you got sick, you didn't pay for it. Something like that. At least the Chinese had that right. You know, all these fund drives that's been going on with cancer, the four big killers of cancer, since President Nixon declared war on cancer in 1971, they spent $200 billion on researching how to cure cancer since 1971. And anytime the United States declares war on anything, it's a miserable failure. The war on poverty, the war on drugs, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan. You know, we always have this, you know, militaristic attitude that we can fix things by carpet bombing it. And so they went after this approach instead of dealing with why we get cancer in a real fundamental, honest sort of way. And what we have is the four largest killers of people in cancer are lung cancer, prostate cancer for men, breast cancer for women, and colorectal cancer for both sexes. And if you look at 1971 all the way to the end to now, this is now Fortune magazine. Fortune magazine's not the Mother Earth News. It's all about money, where the money is. And what Fortune magazine was saying is, we're losing the war on cancer. Now, this is not from hippy-dippy alternative oncologists. This is from the straight oncology wards like Sloan Kettering, MD Anderson, Mayo Clinic. And what the oncologists there are saying is the reason why we're losing the war on cancer is because the cancer models of research are intrinsically flawed. And why are they flawed is because what they need to do to prove whether or not a drug is ripe for launching into the medical community and subsequently the public is to prove that a drug can shrink a tumor by 10% or more in a lab rat. And if it does that, it's fast-tracked. When in fact, what these oncologists are saying is that it's not tumors that kill cancer patients. It's metastatic illness that kills cancer patients. And that means cancer that spreads from the primary site, whether it's the breast or the prostate, and it goes to the brain or the lungs or the bones. That's called metastatic illness. And they don't have any drugs for metastatic illness. None. The only drug there is for metastatic illness is an incredibly vigorous immune system. And a vigorous immune system comes from where? Nutrition. Nutrition comes from where? Nutrient-dense foods, which come from your farms. See, that's the only answer to cancer, is a vigorous immune system. Not the rest of this bunk. I'm not telling people don't get chemotherapy, don't do radiation therapy. I'm saying is, if you want to prevent cancer as a culture, as a people, as a nation, as a society, you have to realize that cancer is not a deficiency of chemotherapy. And the only way to deal with cancer holistically and honestly is to not get it. And once you do get it, start dealing with the organic approaches. Just like if you have an organic farm, you're transitioning and you suddenly get hit with a bunch of pests, whether it's insects or diseases. You know, granted, you're tempted to put out the fire by carpet bombing the pest with some kind of, rescue chemistry. Unless you have an alternative, and there are, fortunately, are more and more alternatives, but in the meantime, you transition away from the dependency on rescue chemistry, which is chemotherapy for agriculture, based on biological systems being intact, and based on plant nutrient density being there in the first instance. This is another oncologist, but what he's saying is the same thing. We can't win the war on cancer the way the models are currently in existence because they have no basis in fact, medically or scientifically. So a few years before that article came out, this article came out, front page in Time magazine, called The Secret Killer. And what this article was talking about was you can basically look at all of these chronic diseases that are growing exponentially, like Alzheimer's, arthritis, cancer, cardiovascular disease, lupus, and on and on and on. These are chronic, incurable diseases. And they're saying you can call it one word, and the word is inflammation. And this article went on to explain how, well, what we could do is we could have drug companies, repatent off-patent drugs that have anti-inflammatory properties to them, and maybe we can put these fires out with these medications that are now generic. It never once went into why are Americans on fire? Where's all this inflammation coming from? And it's an obvious answer. The obvious answer is the inflammation is actually being driven by your own immune system. Inflammatory processes are normal and they're healthy. If you ever sprained your ankle and it swelled up and it got warm, hot, that's inflammation. That's a healthy inflammation. If you get the flu and you get a fever, that's a healing process. Why do you want a temperature elevated? Because it fights the infection. It also burns up the toxins. That's a healthy inflammation. What you don't want is inflammatory conditions going on every day of the week, every month of the year, every year of your middle and older life. That's chronic inflammation because that does a lot of tissue damage and it suppresses your immune system. So that translates into these chronic illnesses that actually take your life or make your life so miserable that you'd rather expire before your time. So this is what is driving it. These are immune factors. These are things called cytokines. These are biochemicals that are made by your immune system. And there they are. These are inflammatory your body makes to fight inflammation. If they're on, again, 24/7, you end up with tissue damage. You end up being chronically ill. So you want to have this fire go out based on the immune system being alerted to the fact that you don't need to be on anymore. You can turn the switch off because there's no need for you to be on anymore. Here's another thing. The analysis of arterial plaque, fat. What's in it? Yeah, there's fat in it. There's cholesterol in it, by the way. And I'm not going to ask anybody in this audience who's on statin drugs, because I know I'll see hands go up and then you're going to hear from me. Because the last thing you want to do is take a statin drug. And the reason why you don't want to take statin drugs is because statin drugs, yikes, where do I go with this one? Statin drugs, here's one of the things statin drugs does that you don't want it to do. It eliminates the liver's capability of producing coenzyme Q10, also known as ubiquinol. Ubiquinol is an anti-inflammatory substance, and it's extremely important to drive the fuel from outside the cell to inside the cell, where it goes into the powerhouse or the furnace called the mitochondria to burn. Your 10 trillion cells approximately, and each cell, each of those 10 trillion cells has anywhere from 2 to 2,500 mitochondria, which is little furnaces. So you're basically a ball of fire. Good fire, burning right? The mitochondria likes to burn fat. It'll burn sugar, but it likes to burn fat. And when it burns fat instead of sugar, you don't get as many free radicals. You know what free radicals are, right? These nasty singlet oxygen species that cause what? Cell membrane damage, right? So there's cholesterol in the plaque, and so they say, there's cholesterol in the plaque, therefore cholesterol causes plaque. But what they don't tell you is that cholesterol is an anti-inflammatory compound, and that every single sex hormone, and actually every hormone in the body, is made starting out with cholesterol. As you get older, what happens is your hormones become imbalanced. So men who start dropping in testosterone, women who start dropping in estrogen, those are all made out of cholesterol. So the body in its wisdom says, I need to ramp up the production of cholesterol because Mrs. Jones is dropping off in estrogen, which came from the cholesterol. All you need to do is get those estrogen, progesterone, testosterone levels balanced, and the cholesterol levels just drop off naturally by themselves. Instead, they got us on statin drugs, which knocks out the coenzyme Q10. So if you look at the warning label of the coenzyme Q10, pick it up. When you open it up, it's as big as my finger, and as you start unraveling, it's as big as this room. You know, it's like the TV commercials in America. You know, they're longer than the ad for the drug. And what it says there, in the event that you feel muscle pain, discontinue use immediately and consult your physician. And of course, a lot of people who take statin drugs feel muscle pain in their legs or their back or their arms or neck. And why do they want you to consult your physician and stop taking it immediately? Is because what's this? It's a muscle. So what happens if the mitochondria of the heart don't get adequate nutrition? It's called congestive heart failure. So instead of having a heart attack, you end up with congestive heart failure, but the last I checked the dictionary, dead is dead, right? And so congestive heart failure is increasing because they're putting all of our elderly people on statin drugs. The other thing that statin drugs inhibit the production of by the liver, same enzyme systems that produce cholesterol, is a compound that you might have heard about that's rich in olive oil called squalene. And squalene happens to be the body's defense against getting cancer. So if you're on statin drugs, and this is all medically documented, the incidence of cancer goes up with people that are on statin drugs because squalene is eliminated. So squalene is found in food. Olive oil, you guys grow olives here, right, in Australia? That's one of the reasons why olive oil is good. It's not because of the omega-9. It's got this wonderful compound called squalene in it, particularly if it's an unprocessed compound. So yeah, there's fats in plaque, but you'll find out that most of the fat isn't saturated fat, it's omega-6 fats, which are what? Cereal grain oil fats, not the fats from dairy products and eggs, you know, the vilified foods that raise your cholesterol levels, which by the way, rarely do. Your body makes most of the cholesterol because it's an anti-inflammatory agent, and if you have lesions in the plumbing of your vascular system, cholesterol patches it up, otherwise you would hemorrhage. Cholesterol is your friend. 25% of your cholesterol is in your brain, which explains to me that Congress eats fat-free foods. They must, because there's no cholesterol up there. I mean, none, absolutely none. So here's the Framingham heart study, which the cardiologist will actually point to and say, there's the proof that high-fat foods create problems, when in fact, just the opposite is true. 80% of heart attacks with similar LDL levels of those who did not have heart attacks. Twice as many individuals with a lifetime total cholesterol of less than 200. You get the cholesterol less than 200, you're going to get really depressed. And one of the reasons why you're going to get really depressed if you're a guy is because you're going to have ED. Then you get to take what? Cialis, Viagra, which cause other problems. So then you can't sleep. So now you're on sleeping pills, another drug to get a woody in the morning, and something that actually makes you depressed. I mean, this is exactly what I'm looking for. You know, I can't wait to have these three medications because none of them work anyway. You know, the main reason why there is so much ED is because getting rid of cholesterol means getting rid of testosterone. I had a gentleman younger than me one time who picked me up for a conference. We had a 2.5-hour drive to the place this conference was going to be, and he thought he had a captive audience, and he did. And he said, I need to ask you something. And I said, what is it? And he said, I need to ask you, how do I ask this? I said, what? What do you have to ask me? And he said, his wife was in the car. And he said, well, I need to ask you, I don't have any libido. This man was in his late 50s. I said, you're on Lipitor or something like that. He said, how did you know that? I said, because you don't have any testosterone. That's made from cholesterol. You got rid of the cholesterol. I said, it's real simple. Follow the bouncing ball, you know? He wanted to know what supplements he could take, you know, that jack up his libido. And I said, Stop taking the Lipitor, you're not going to have a heart attack. His wife happened to be a woman from Pennsylvania whose family were dairy farmers, Germans. And I looked at her and I said, "You're German, Pennsylvania German?" This was in the Midwest. And she said, "Yep." And I said, "Ever hear of a lard sandwich?" She said, "Oh yeah, I grew up on them." "Grandfather ate them?" She said, "Yep." "How long did he live to be?" 91. "Father ate them?" "Yep." "How long did he live to be?" "I think he was still alive at 90. And I looked at him and I said, "Start eating lard sandwiches, get rid of the statin drugs, buy purple sheets, and go on a second honeymoon, because it's exactly what you need." So the caloric myth, a calorie is a calorie. So this is a study that was done, but you can see 50% to lose 40 pounds at 1 to 5 pounds a week if you have the same number of calories, but you're seeing that 400 calories came from fat versus 400 calories from carbohydrates, where you had 1% to lose 40 pounds at 1 to 5 pounds a week. Carbohydrates drive obesity, drive cholesterol, drive inflammation. The Paleolithic diet is the diet that we're genetically hardwired for. Good fats, coconut oil, oils from animals, butter, cream, the tallow that comes from animal fats on grass. Of course, it's loaded with omega-3s, some omega-6s. Omega-6s are not a bad fat, they're essential. It's the damaged omega-6s that come from the fryer fats in the fast food restaurants that'll cause all the damage. Glycemic index versus glycemic load. So we hear about glycemic index. Look at glycemic load next time. Here's an example of pasta, apple, and broccoli, cup of each. Glycemic indexes are comparable, similar. But when you go to the glycemic load, see what happens with pasta. This is American pasta, by the way. Versus an apple versus broccoli. That's a measure of what's driving insulin, the glycemic load, what's driving insulin. Studies that were done in the 90s on body fat. When you're dealing with inflammation, the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 is very critical. Omega-6 is essential, you must have it. Omega-3 is essential, you must have it. But it's the ratio balance that really is critical, because omega-6s are the raw materials that drive inflammatory or pro-inflammatory prostaglandins. And omega-3s are raw materials that drive the anti-inflammatory prostaglandins. So when you look at the ratio of the diet, the paleo diet, somewhere between 1 and 1, 2 to 1, of 6 to 3. 6 to 3, 2 parts to 1 part, 6 to 1 part 3. And these are the diets that you see from New Zealand Maori that are still native diets back then. Japanese, it's about 4.5 to 1. The New Zealand Maori is a little 2.8 to 1. And the Americans back then was 17.6 to 1. And in some cases, it's over 20 to 1, omega-6 to omega-3. This is not good. And most of those omega-6s, I'll guarantee, are damaged omega-6s because most people cook with them. They're polyunsaturated fats. Saturated fat has a high, basically, it's a high oxidation rate. Right? So you can cook it at high temperatures and you don't damage the fat structure. You can't cook with omega-3s. Anybody ever cook with flaxseed oil? You can't do that. You can cook with omega-6s, like corn oil, safflower oil, but they get rancid pretty quickly. So these are damaged fats. Damaged fats cause damaged cell membranes because the cell membrane is fat. And your fatty compounds migrate to the 10 trillion cells that I'm talking about. If you have a cell membrane that's damaged from oxidative substances, you end up with what? Instead of very pliable cell membranes, you end up with very rigid cell membranes. That means you have premature aging in the cell. And remember, your cells. So here's some of the crap you see with going on in the pharmaceutical industry. This study was back in August of 2010, New England Journal of Medicine, which is a renowned peer-reviewed journal. More omega-3 fats did in 8 heart patients, 4,800 men and women, history of heart attacks. 40 months on margarine enriched with EPA, DHA, and LA, that's omega-3s. And margarine considered a placebo. So what do they say? The margarine that was enriched with the omega-3s versus just straight margarine made no difference. But what's really the problem here? They've already sabotaged the entire trial by starting out with margarine, which is damaged omega-6s to begin with, right? There's no way you could prove omega-3s work with a trial like that. Meanwhile, you know, we have anthropologists, sociologists, and medical authorities investigating the Arctic Circle inhabitants, the Eskimos and the Inuit, and they're amazed that these people can actually survive the heavy metal contamination from the industrial European countries in America, North America, because that comes down and congregates in the Arctic Circle. But what they're looking at, these people, this is a guy that's actually hunting beluga whales with a homemade harpoon in a kayak made out of skins strapped over a frame. And what they were saying is they're looking at the diet and they're saying, well, you know, these guys eat beluga whale meat, has 10 times the iron of beef, twice the protein, 5 times the vitamin A. 70-year-old Inuit men have coronary arteries as elastic as 20-year-old Danish men do. Eating blubber, right? Eating blubber. They're not getting apples up there. There's no avocados in the Arctic, I can tell you that, you know. So the government officials are concerned that these people might switch to processed foods because of the contaminants that are coming down and ending up in the food chain. And this man was interviewed and he said, I can't eat your food because I don't have the strength then to hunt or to fish if I eat your food, which is these refined carbohydrate-based foods. And as the medical authorities called it, processed foods loaded with carbs, sugar, risking malnourishment, vitamin deficiencies, heart disease, diabetes, and obesity. So they know that Inuit people who eat our food get sick and die. But in the meantime, they're advising our culture here to continue in the food pyramid, which is primarily grain-based. Anybody know who this guy is? Weston Price? Right. So this is a guy who's a Cleveland dentist. And notice that his patients' children were coming into his clinic with worse teeth than their parents, more cavities, more deformities, less bone formation that was healthy. He spent 10 years, he and his wife, traveling to every corner of the globe in isolated villages where people were not contaminated in the 30s by Western processed foods. He even came to Australia. He went to New Zealand. He went to Africa, Central and South America, Polynesia, in the South Pacific, and the Arctic Circle. In fact, here's where he went, 14 different locations, the Swiss Alps, the islands of Scotland. And even though these diets vary tremendously, what he did find out was consistency. He found out that those people, no matter where they lived and what kind of foods they ate, they had all something in common. They had 400 to 500% more mineral intake and 10 times or 1,000% more vitamin A, D, E, and K intake. Now, what's the significance of that? It's those minerals with those fat-soluble vitamins. Key, fat-soluble means you can only get them where? In fat. Can't get them in Cheerios, which they say gets rid of your cholesterol. You eat a bowl of Cheerios or oatmeal and your cholesterol levels go down. It's in the fat where the fat-soluble vitamins are found, no matter where you lived. And those minerals that are in the diet 5 times more, 500% more, are synergistic with those fat-soluble compounds to make things like no tooth decay, no cancer, no arthritis and joint deformities, no child morbidity and mortality, longevity. All these people lived these healthy lives and looked good compared to people in the West who had tremendous amounts of problems with these issues. And also cancer. If you look at all the anthropologists that were in the 19th century, early 20th century that actually investigated isolated cultures, what did they find out? Lots of diversity in their food, in their consumption of food. Hunter-gatherers before agriculture ate somewhere between 10,000 to 80,000 foods seasonally because they followed game, and there's that many plants out there, believe it or not. So even if you're eating the game, let's say you're eating a lot of seafood as a Paleolithic person, don't you think that even though you might be eating maybe a dozen different kinds of seafoods, you're eating a lot of different vegetables called seagrass and algae, things like that? In 1900, this is a big alarming thing right now that's brought up, that all the types of apples and vegetables, types of meat are all disappearing. We're losing our genetic diversity. And of course, GMOs is making the case that we can only feed the world. Conjugated linoleic acid, this is something that, you know, is only found in ruminants from fat animals. Lots of research started here with Perotti in Australia. You can't get it anywhere else. Only ruminants that eat what? Forages. Cancer and CLA. One of the most potent anti-cancer compounds is found in this very unusual omega-3, omega-6 fatty acid. And this is stuff that's found in the Swiss Alps. Animals that were grazing the tallest pastures with the most weeds, herbs, had the highest levels of CLA, up to 300% more. Main reason why? The wild plants were the concentration of the raw materials for it. These are the carotenoids and the terpenoids and the phenolics, the flavonoids are found. These are the medicines that are in the color of the rainbow. I'll talk about that tomorrow. And even the food industry is jumping into this. You can see that with the They used to call those things prunes. Now they call them dried plums. It's got that nursing home connotation. And they're measuring antioxidant compounds found in these fruits, in these colors. This is a friend of mine, Carl Delafeld, who's a grazer in America. That I have a bunch of his slides. I only have time for one, but he measured his steaks. You know, in this case, it was just total trace minerals, but he did CLA, he did omega-3s, omega-6s, and what he found out, consistent, huge differences on animals that were grazed and harvested. See, this is why farmers have got to get on this, because you're the only guys that have these kinds of products. You're the only places that you can get this stuff. And this is what we've done for the last 100 years. Industrialize the agriculture with acidified fertilizers, got rid of our topsoil, got rid of our biology. Now we end up with the USDA sink like this, the trough that looks like we've got hardly anything left nutrient density wise. And here's this sum, I'll just go through quickly, but on the right hand side you can see these are vegetables in the red ink, the losses. You know, you can see 70%, 44%. Here's beef and chicken. Look at the vitamin A levels I highlighted here. 100% loss in ground beef and 70% loss in chicken in vitamin A. What do you think happened between 1963 and 1992? Feedlots, off grass. And this is Ben Brooks' work showing that organic farming, even though they're not putting a lot of those minerals on there, some of those levels are off the charts in terms of the amount of minerals. And this comes from the natural minerals that are in the soil as well as what you might apply. But nobody's putting on vanadium, nobody's putting on selenium typically. Molybdenum is rarely put on, iodine is never put on. And yet iodine went up 500% with biological practices. Carotenoids. Beta-carotene is one carotenoid. There's over 600 carotenoids now identified. Lutein is found in where? Collard green, spinach, and egg yolks from grass. Lycopene, the red pigment, makes the tomato and prostate glands healthy. Cruciferous vegetables, all right, look at the studies we're seeing here. If that was a drug, the stock on that drug would go right through the stratosphere. University of Hawaii, Harvard University, Vanderbilt, 50% reductions in these so-called incurable cancers like bladder cancer, prostate cancer. Because there's all these other compounds that detoxify the liver and actually inhibit the growth of it. Are you on fire? Because if you're on fire, you know, it's a food issue. It's not a deficiency of a drug. These are some of the questions. Are you rested upon waking? You have a lot of energy? Do you crave carbs? Headaches? Overweight? Strong hair and nails? Clear-minded, easy to focus? Not hungry 4 to 6 hours following dinner? No chronic pain? Regular? So, and you can get this on my website, so I don't have to spend all the time on it, but it's the stuff that you already know about. It's the pigment-rich foods. It's the grass-fed animal products. High-fat diet. Most of your calories, folks, should be coming from good fats, not carbs. Carbs are third on the list. Second source of calories should be coming from good quality proteins. Last but not least is good quality carbohydrates, mostly from vegetables like squashes. And these are the foods to avoid. Stay away from this stuff. I get questions asked all the time, like, you know, Brunetti talk about so much stuff. Can't you just boil cancer down to like 2 things? Fine, stay away from the sugar and get off the bad damaged omega-6 fats, and you already accomplished 75%. So, I'm on time. So are you. Thanks for listening. Have a great dinner. Bon appetit. Right.